Gerard V. Bradley, professor of law at the University of Notre Dame, where he teaches legal ethics and constitutional law. Together with John Finnis, he directs the Natural Law Institute and co-edits the American Journal of Jurisprudence and International Forum for Legal Philosophy. He's been a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution of Stanford, and he's a senior fellow at the Witherspoon Institute in Princeton, New Jersey. He served for many years as president of the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars. Professor Bradley received his BA and JD from Cornell University, graduating summa cum laude from the law school in 1980. After serving in the trial division of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, he joined the law faculty at the University of Illinois and then moved to Notre Dame in 1992. I guess just in time for Lee versus Wiseman and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, right? He has published over 100 scholarly articles and reviews. His most recent books are an edited collection of essays entitled Challenges to Religious Liberty in the 21st Century, and Essays on Law, Religion, and Morality, and Unquiet Americans, U.S. Catholics and the Common Good. He's also currently working on a book on obscenity in the internet age, and he's also been a very active participant in the American Public Philosophy Institute since its birth in 1989. So he's an old friend and colleague, and it's wonderful to have him here speaking on religious liberty and the common good.
I do want to say something about religious liberty and the common good, and I'm talking about today, not historically, and I propose to investigate my topic, again, religious liberty and the common good, within a specifically Catholic framework. But I also mean to contend and to be contending for the simple truth of the matter. Well, not simple as in uncomplicated. I mean to consider a crucial but neglected aspect of the relationship between religious liberty and the common good by working through what I might call a puzzle, or perhaps more exactly, looking for the missing piece in a puzzle, or considering a gap within church teaching about religious liberty and the common good, with a special look at the Declaration on Religious Freedom from the Council, Dignitatis Humanae. Hereafter, DH, Dignitatis Humanae, DH. But note well, the cogency, the validity, the truth value, if any, of what I say here today does not depend, again, doesn't depend upon accepting the contents of revelation or faith, or the authority of the church, or accepting DH as inspired by the Holy Spirit. I don't deny any of that, but what follows could be taken without remainder as a philosophical reflection, one which happens to be suffused with Catholic examples and illustrations. So here goes. Our exploration is blessed by a remarkable stability of the key coordinates. To this minute, the Church's pastors rely verbatim upon the Second Vatican Council's articulation of both the common good and religious liberty. Most commonly cited in authoritative Catholic documents to this minute, and even as an example of the Church's teaching in scholarly critical investigations of the matter, most commonly cited for the common good is probably Gaudium et Spes 26, where the Council Fathers wrote that the common good is the sum of those conditions of social life that allow social groups and their individual members relatively thorough access to their own fulfillment. The corresponding expression in DH differs in verbal content, but the meaning of it is the same. So DH on the common good. The common welfare of society consists in the entirety of those conditions of social life under which men enjoy the possibility of achieving their own perfection in a certain fullness and also with some relative ease. Now, the proximate cause, so to speak, of both of these formulations of the common good is certainly Pope St. John the 23rd's encyclical Mother and Teacher, Mater et Magistra, issued on the 70th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, that is issued on May 15th, 1961, which formulation from MM of the common good was repeated in Pacem in Terris, also by John the 23rd, 2 years later, which was promulgated during the council itself. But here more about the basic stability of this term, its meaning, common good. We can see the basics of the councils and John's formulations throughout the pontificate of Pius XII. I think most nearly unmistakably in Pius's 1942 Christmas message. In 1942, Pius XII said that the common good is comprised of those external conditions that are necessary for the development of citizens' qualities and functions of their material, intellectual, and religious life. And before Pius XII, the main lines, or most of the main lines, of the Council's teaching, which is today's teaching of the meaning of the common good, can be found in the popes, at least going back to Leo XIII, and possibly beyond. I haven't considered that myself. The substance of these formulations from the Council and beyond into more distant history passed into the authoritative catechism and into the official but non-authoritative compendium, the social doctrine of the Church. They are now woven into the sinews of Catholic thought about political matters. One aside or footnote. In the Catechism, the substance of the Vatican II formulation is retained, but curiously, unexplained to me, the word vocation appears, so that the Catechism talks about persons having ready access to fulfillment of their vocations within the context of the common good. I have no idea how that term, word, vocation came to be in the Catechism. It might be an interesting investigation for a student here. I suspect it's meaningful, and it's a reference to personal vocation, and not just to whether someone's a priest or sister, married or single. Now, the unsurpassably important truth captured in all of these formulations is this: any political community today must create and maintain vast, complex, practical enterprises, highways, armies, defenses, markets, courts, all of them possessing an internal logic of their own and possessed of overriding purposes, so that the purpose of highways is safe and speedy transport. The purpose of an army and defenses is protection from attack and, I guess, success in warfare. But here's the great truth. This immense ensemble of what Pius, for example, called external conditions is not an end in itself, insofar as it must be dedicated to giving persons a realistic opportunity to direct their own lives according to moral and religious truth, thus to perfect or fulfill themselves. This is the central meaning of the profound truth, not a commonplace, but can be found throughout the tradition of Western political philosophy. Maybe it's in the Greek authors, but it at least goes back as far as Justinian, the great Roman jurist. But the great truth that society is for the individual person, not the other way around. The state and its law and all of its exertions are for the person, not the reverse. So far on the common good. It seems to me, however, that so far stated, there's a real risk of misunderstanding the common good and a real risk of miscarriage in attempts to care for it. For one thing, the use of terms like, in Pius's expression, external conditions suggests that the common good consists of material things, concrete opportunities, legal entities, huge enterprises, that is, practical things. But the condition, most important to the real flourishing of persons, is much more intangible. It's culture. Culture is the essential, and I think the most important component of the common good. Culture, not arts, the Metropolitan Museum of Art and Opera, but rather the mentality, the thoughts, the habits, the beliefs, the values of the people in that political community. Now, all these expressions about the common good are also liable to be taken as exhausting the meaning or the components or as a full account of the common good. Instead, I think read in context, that is, each of the expressions by Pius, maybe going back as far as Leo, but from the Council, thereafter, I think read in context, it's not easy, but rather clearly after looking at it for a while, that these are really accounts of the political common good, specifically about what the modern bureaucratic state and its law can properly and helpfully do to promote people's flourishing. But we must insist, and we should recognize, that the common good is not reducible to what government does or doesn't do. Public authorities, for example, affect culture mightily in some countries, and they can affect culture for good or for ill. But nowhere does government monopolize culture, and there are severe limits, both normatively and practically, to what the state and its law can do about a people's culture. So to sum up just a bit, culture is an essential part, and maybe, I think, the most important part of the common good, and it is something that is only secondarily and in indirect ways in the care of the state. So I think of the definition of the common good found a little bit later in Gaudium et Spes, in section 74, is perhaps the most helpful one around, for it says that the common good embraces such conditions. That is, that the common good includes, but is not limited to, external factors and social context, whereby men, families, and associations, now I'm quoting from Gaudium et Spes 74, more adequately and readily attain their perfection. The common good is more than an ensemble of conditions. Its scope extends well beyond the state's proper competence. Everyone has responsibilities to promote the common good. Everyone has the opportunity and the responsibility to create and maintain an environment conducive to living in accord with the truth. Now, DH and religious liberty. Dignitas Humanae, DH, says that religious liberty is, I'm quoting, immunity from coercion in matters religious, close quote. Now, because morally justified coercion is pretty much limited to public authority, it's understandable to think of religious liberty as a civil right, to think of it as something that you're liable to find in the Bill of Rights. And you do find it in the Bill of Rights for the United States and the corresponding state bills of rights and the European Declaration of Rights. So you see it as joined to limitations upon the state. As I say, it's natural to think then of religious liberty as about the state's power, and it being specifically a limitation on the state's power. And it's not unreasonable to think of it, in part, as a moral constraint, legally enforceable where it's found in the Constitution, upon the exercise of government power. But it's incomplete and misleading to think of religious liberty just as the relationship between the government and between the government and people. Full stop. The liberty affirmed in DH is not only a civil right, it is a natural right. It addresses government and constrains public authority, yes, but it also does so for everyone. So now reading from Dignitatis Humanae, in this case, section 2. This freedom, meaning religious freedom, means that all men are to be immune from coercion on the part of any human individual or of social groups and of any human power. Different part of Dignitatis Humanae now. This is section 4. Another definition of religious liberty. Everyone ought at all times refrain from any manner of action which might seem to carry a hint of coercion. or of a kind of persuasion that would be dishonorable or unworthy. Now here then is one pillar of the common good as it pertains to religion and religious liberty. Respect by everyone of everyone's freedom in religious matters, as well as everyone doing what they rightly can to protect other people from being subjected to coercion, pressure, manipulation, and unworthy persuasion in religious matters. Law has an important role to play here, but it's an especially delicate one. It's especially delicate, for example, in our culture, well, more so in Europe, I think, than in America, but in both places. I think this question of how to protect people from pressure, coercion, and unworthy manners of persuasion by other people in matters of religion, I think it's the core question in really the debates. I mean, despite what else is there, and background static, and even some foreground prejudice or bias, I suppose. But in the debates about Muslim attire, about women's attire, right? The scarf, the veil, and the robe, where I think the main concern of courts looking at this question, and the main concern of lawmakers who legislate on the question, has been for women and girls who do not want to wear the headscarf or the veil, but who would be subject to pressure or more by especially male relatives or vigilantes within their own community, were the veil legally permitted? So again, I think that question, which is really on the surface of it, is the question in the cases about the headscarf, et cetera, whether it's in France, Germany, or someplace else, and it's mostly a European question, mostly, has to do with protecting, if it's going to be justified, let me put it that way, if the bans on the veil in public, for example, ought to be justified, and I think they can be, I think the ground of justification would have to be right here. An attempt by government to protect people's women's attempts to live freely, and to freely choose where, when, and how to manifest their Muslim beliefs without pressure and coercion from the men within the community. I think that's the question. But anyway, the main thing at this point is to say about religious liberty, it seems to be all in on freedom of religion. It's a strikingly negative liberty. Freedom from coercion, pressure, unworthy persuasion by anyone. But freedom from force and manipulation is indeed essential to religious liberty. It is not the whole of it. It's actually better to think of it this way, as if DH sets up a social structure or a superstructure where the basic rules in the superstructure have to do with freedom of each person from pressure exerted by other persons. And in that sense, you might say it's even about personal autonomy, the superstructure. But unless this superstructure is suffused, just filled up, surrounded, and given meaning and illumined by the right cultural stuff, which I'll call the infrastructure, a scheme or a system of laws, a community committed to each one's free quest for religious truth is actually, I submit, very likely to derail into something else. So let me just say that point again. Without the right culture of religious liberty, the superstructure of religious liberty, freedom from coercion, is very likely to derail into something else, a kind of religious identity construction, a kind of religious subjectivity, where religious liberty becomes part of something larger, not exactly or properly just about religion. I think without the right culture suffusing the superstructure, religious liberty is liable to collapse into an embracing doctrine about self-invention, self-definition, autonomy, and in that respect, identity. This subjectivity is acidic. It corrodes the undercarriage of genuine religious liberty, especially including the whole notion that religion is about objective truth. Now, I think, curiously, DH says nothing explicitly about the shape and content of the cultural supports which it actually requires for the successful operation in society of religious liberty. In fact, DH uses the word culture twice, both adjectivally and neither of any consequence in the document. Curiously, you could compare this invisibility of culture in DH to the overflowing roster of serious engagements with culture in Gaudium and Spes, which was promulgated the same day, December 7th, 1965, as DH. We can fill in the missing elements of DH by resort to plain implication and sound inference. Again, this is the gap or missing piece in the puzzle that I spoke about right at the very beginning. Missing from DH is the infrastructure that is necessary to support it and to keep religious liberty from derailing into an identity project. It's not there, but we can supply it by looking at what is in DH, and that's what I propose to do in the balance of what I'm about to say. And I think this operation, I call it superstructure, infrastructure, you could call it something else. You can call it yin and yang if you wish. But I think it can be somewhat usefully compared to what the two recent scholar popes, Benedict and JP2, said so often about markets and democracy. At different points during the pontificates, but each, I think quite powerfully and very largely correctly, warned Western democracies, those with market economies, that markets are really mechanisms for governing exchange, and they're very efficient and useful as far as they go. But without a proper moral culture, or without a culture suffused with certain relevant virtues, the market becomes a mean of exploitation. Again, now JP2, well, both JP2 and Benedict, talked about democracy, that without a culture of life, for example, and a culture of human rights and respect for everyone's dignity, democracy just becomes a means of counting votes and establishing who has power, and has no tendency to actually lead to, or is not conducive to, a just society. So that democracy and markets can become like mechanisms, sort of not agnostic, but morally indifferent mechanisms, like tools, used for good or ill depending upon the host culture's commitment to human rights or respect for everyone, or a commitment to the welfare of everyone, notwithstanding the commitment to a market economy, right? So somewhat similarly here. The definition of religious liberty as freedom from coercion can become a matter of ill, I think, and as I say, derail into something unfortunate unless it is sort of sustained by the proper culture. Well, with that delay, let's turn to what that culture actually is. First, culture is, according to these two recent popes, fundamentally the religious question, just on a larger scale. Pope St. John Paul II wrote in Sanctissimus Annus, "At the heart of every culture lies the attitude man takes to the greatest mystery, the mystery of God. Different cultures are basically different ways of facing the question of the meaning of personal existence." As that pope once said to Francis Cardinal George, faith creates culture. Benedict XVI told visiting American bishops in 2012, "At the heart of every culture, whether perceived or not, is a consensus about the nature of reality." To representatives of French culture, Pope Benedict said in 2008, "What gave Europe's culture its foundation, namely the search for God and the readiness to listen to God, remains today the basis of any genuine culture." In other words, culture is, or at least should be, organized around the quest for the truth about divine things. Second, in his 2011 World Day of Peace message, Benedict spoke more pointedly, about culture and religious freedom than he did at any other time. He spoke of the religious dimension of culture, built up over the centuries thanks to the social and especially ethical contributions of religion. In September of 2008 in Paris, Benedict said, religious freedom is an achievement of a sound political and juridical culture. Now, that's my motto or theme in a nutshell. Now, I'm going to adapt Benedict's expression. I say religious liberty is a cultural achievement, principally and essentially. Religious liberty is not actually principally, although it is essentially, a matter of freedom from coercion. But for true religious liberty, you need the cultural support. And in that respect, it's a cultural achievement. It's not something found as part of the fruit of the earth. And it's not, that is, religious liberty is not so obviously conducive to human happiness that no society could fail to promote it. It's an elusive and inherently fragile cultural achievement. What are the mainstays of a culture of religious liberty? Well, according to Dignitatis Humanae, religious freedom is plainly comprised of two duties. Now, Father Joe said a few things last night and then kicked off a discussion that was carried on both during the Q&A then and by some of us afterwards about the relationship between rights and duties. Now, I don't know if what I'm about to say about DH is a perfect example of what Father Joe was saying about the relationship between rights and duties, but it may well be a good example, if not a perfect example. But DH says religious freedom is really comprised of two duties. The first binds everyone: refrain from coercion and all manner of manipulation of other people when it comes to religious questions. This is the freedom from. But the second is the duty of everyone with regard to religion. It's the correlative freedom for. It's for each person to fulfill his or her duty to seek the truth in religious matters. Call this the positive liberty. The freedom from coercion is so that people can carry out their duty to seek, identify, and live in accord with religious truth. So here's an example, I think, of what Father Joe was mainly saying, where the duty supports or is correlative to the right, and the sense of the right is tied to the duty. So I think, here just following the lead of Dignitatis Humanae, but filling in, you might say, some absent text, essential to the possibility of genuine religious liberty on the ground is a supportive culture characterized by a high degree of cultural, popular, not on paper as a resolution by some people at some point in time, but a living, breathing culture which is committed to three propositions. And here I begin the last part of my prepared remarks. First proposition is that religion is a zone of truth, not an enclave or the province of tradition, custom, identity, wishful thinking, emotional projections, and edifying fables. So again, the first is that religion is a zone of truth. The second is that there's an important, and even I would say overriding, inalienable moral duty to seek out and embrace religious truth. The third is that religious liberty has to be securely distinguished from other sorts of liberty, even from the rights of conscience, with which it partly overlaps. Religious liberty is not the same thing as conscience. Conscience is important. It's not the same thing as religious liberty, and in a way I'll try to describe, it's in a way secondary to religious liberty. Without these three cultural anchors, and no matter how much freedom from external interference characterizes a society, there simply won't be religious liberty. That's what I submit. So let me explain, and then I'll be done. By zone of truth, I do not mean, specifically Catholic faith, the truths of my faith, such as we find them in the Creed or the Decalogue elsewhere in Scripture. That's not what I'm referring to when I say religion has to be culturally understood and the culture be committed to religion as a zone of truth. I don't there refer to the truths of, for example, Catholic faith. Rather, DH doesn't depend upon that, at least the first part of Dignitatis Humanae, the parts which I've been looking at with you, don't depend upon the truths of Catholic faith. It depends instead upon an essential precondition or implication of all of DH, front and back, which is that religion is the kind of thing that is either true or false. I mean, it includes other elements that have nothing to do with truth and falsity, like a commitment, the commitment of a friend or disciple to the Lord. There are elements, obviously, of religious faith, certainly of Christian faith, which don't have to do with propositions or anything else that could be true or false, is the existential adherence to the master. But true or false is part of religion, that religion which is necessary to make sense of Dignitatis Humanae. And true or false here means objectively the case or not the watered down, more subjective sense of true, such that my religion is true for me because it corresponds to my experience of God, and that my religion expresses more adequately than any other religion the religion that I feel in my heart. The right understanding of religion as a zone of truth is not the more anticipatory truth of self-assertion, or what's often denoted by the term personal identity, such that one projects an idealized image of oneself and thereafter strives to become that ideal. And where that ideal is articulated in religious terms, it has the truth of a kind of aspiration about me. Now that's, my point is just a long-winded way of saying that religion is about reality. The different world religions, in great part, are different accounts of reality, including most especially those spiritual aspects of reality, which are impervious to measurement and touch, especially those realities which can only be known to humankind by God's self-disclosure, revelation. Religion is answerable to the truth about the universe, to all that there is, seen and unseen. And our understanding of all of this, the bigger picture, though forever incomplete so long as we live on earth, must nonetheless be coherent as far as it goes. So religion answers to both what is really the case and to the demands of logic. What we think we know about the nature of reality has to cohere, that is, be internally coherent. Any society's culture and law includes manifold and innumerable opportunities for everyone, not just the government, not even mainly the government. In fact, possibly not the government very much at all, but the culture and law includes manifold opportunities for people to register their understanding of religion as including truths about reality. It is, I think, most important in our culture. I think it's essential that the churches witness to this way of conceiving and understanding what religion is about. If the churches give up on the idea of religion being in central part, not exhaustively, but in great part and in essential part, being an account of how the universe is, if the churches give up on that, and frankly many have, then I think it's lights out for the culture's possibility of sustaining religion as a zone of truth. In addition, everyone, second component of the culture of religious liberty, everyone has a moral responsibility to seek religious truth and to live in accord with it. Any number of quotations, each one maybe better than the others. From DH, I'll read a few, but these are all from Dignitatis Humanae. All men are bound to seek the truth, especially in what concerns God and his church, and to embrace the truth they come to know and to hold fast to it, in the first section of DH. From the second section of DH. All men are impelled by nature and also by moral obligation to seek the truth, especially religious truth. They're also bound to adhere to the truth once it is known, and to order their whole lives around or in accord with the demands of truth. Now, why should this particular moral requirement be so urgent? And Dignitatis Humanae says and implies it's of overriding significance. On what grounds could the recent popes stress that this question is in a way at the heart of any culture. The questions about divine things are at the heart of culture, so say the recent popes. And since the council, if not before, religious liberty and the duty to seek the truth about divine things is at the heart of the moral life. Well, one answer to the question, why is this duty, this moral obligation to the truth so urgent? One answer was supplied by a young Polish archbishop when he intervened in the council's discussion of Dignitatis Humanae, in this particular instance, on behalf of the entire Polish Bishops' Conference. Again, speaking on behalf of the conference, this young archbishop asserted that the liberty protected was so large because the corresponding moral duty was so large and pressing. Watiwa maintained that a person's relationship to God is of, now the Latin I think was maximus, so the person's relationship to God is of maximal and everlasting importance. He implied, he didn't say, he implied that this duty was preeminent in the person's moral life, and so should fulfilling it, in part by access to religious liberty, should be central and is of overriding importance in social life. Now, getting people, our culture, our law too, but more important, the culture, to take this duty of each one to seek, identify, and live in accord with religious truth, it's obviously heavy going today, and people would need to be, well, catechized may not be the right word, but people are facing an uphill battle to even come to see religion as true, and then to see that each one bears this inalienable and important moral duty. Explaining it to people and its importance is handicapped by the fact it's not a norm of justice, as if we owed it to other people to seek the truth, and that we might have wronged somebody else, committed an injustice by not seeking the truth. That's not the way it works. But so we don't have an appeal to justice, you might say, to rely upon. It's not quite a duty to God, I think, that is to seek the truth about God. I don't think it's correct to say it's a duty to God. Even if it were, modern societies do not much care about those things. It's not quite a duty to oneself either, as if ignoring it would be a kind of victimless immorality. I don't know if that's the way to describe what I'm talking about, as a person who's indifferent about religious truth and the search for it, as if they're committing a victimless immorality. And there's certainly no basis for legally punishing or sanctioning anyone who fails to conscientiously investigate divine matters. And trying to force anyone, by less drastic means and legal means, to engage in this search is self-defeating. You can't make another person, you can't make them care about what's true, especially about divine things. You have to lead them to see that it's no fit way to live indifferent to divine things, but they have to come to see that they are obliged, and they're not obliged by any duty to you or me. You certainly can't make another person honestly believe in the truth of any proposition about God. Trying to do that can only result in, pretend assent and insincere religion. I think here the only possible fruitful way to go is to engender a set of cultural expectations and a whole social milieu in which everyone who values the esteem of others and who wishes to be involved with the culture's most urgent subjects will naturally want to engage in serious theological conversation. Well, here you may say my naivete is showing, but as I said, it was going to be an uphill battle. Third requirement, third element, component of a religious liberty culture. I guess it's an implication of the first two. I mentioned it earlier when I talked about conscience not being the same thing. It's that religious liberty has to be distinguished from other sorts of liberties, some of which it overlaps with, and always, religious liberty, tethered tightly to the first two pillars, zone of truth, moral duty. Now, at least in a culture like ours, most countries in Europe too, where cultures were once determined by Christianity, But where religion there, in those places, becomes basically a non-cognitive enterprise, an aspect of identity or an expression of emotion, or some attempt by persons to give voice to some primordial religious experience. And that's what I mean by non-cognitive. Where once determined by Christianity, but now succeeded by, I'll say it, liberal Protestantism, where religion is really an expression of feelings, religious liberty can't avoid collapsing into a freedom to manifest one's own spiritual identity and brand. Put differently, to detach religious liberty from truth, I think, is to decapitate it. And this really is the danger today in post-Christian societies. And it's the peril that's often abetted by treating religious liberty as a synonym for rights of conscience. Conscience, properly understood, is about me and the inner integrity, or the integral integrity of my thoughts, feelings, decisions, and actions. Conscience is very important, but it is about me and the wholeness or integration of me. In that respect, it's subjective. It's not about the truth of the cosmos. Now, in his 2010 Christmas greeting to the Roman Curia, Benedict XVI, I'm expanding on this notion of conscience and religious freedom. Benedict noted that in modern thinking, the word conscience signifies that for moral and religious questions, it's the subjective dimension, the individual, that constitutes the final authority for decision. That's Benedict. He observed further that the modern world is divided into the realms of the objective and the subjective. Religion and morals, the Pope continued, lie within the subjective realm. Here, it is said, there are in the final analysis no objective criteria. Quote from Benedict. Not, I would emphasize, by any indicia of objective truth. Benedict concluded this portion of his remarks, and I will conclude mine as well, by stating that, now I'm quoting Benedict again, conscience is both capacity for truth and obedience to the truth which manifests itself to anyone who seeks it with an open heart. Close quote. The path of conversion is a path of conscience, not a path of self-asserting subjectivity. On the contrary, the path of conversion is the path of obedience to truth. And further I say it not. Questions? Yes?
Hi, thank you for coming and everything like that. You've given us a real great overview of what religious liberty is, but I want to key in on something you said real early in your speech. You mentioned that I might have a personal obligation to protect somebody else's right to religious liberty. And I would wonder about maybe the limits on that and where that stems from.
Right, it's a very good question. And it's a question to be taken very seriously, well, for several reasons, one of which is that there are no glib or short answers. But I do think that corresponding to, if not implied by, but corresponding to everyone's obligation to refrain from manipulating other people, engaging in dishonest or unworthy methods of persuasion, proselytizing in some unfair way, even putting pressure on people to take this point of view about religion or the other. That's everyone's duty. But I think that if it doesn't imply, it corresponds to a duty. But I think I said, and I certainly hope I said, do what each one properly can to protect others from such subjugation. Now, there are several sources of limits upon that obligation. I can think of several. But one is that there really are serious moral limitations upon what anybody should do to intervene in someone else's family life, for example. So that the question about the relationship between parents and children, let's be more exact, between parents and, say, teenage children. My son Brendan, who's 17. On the question of religious observance is a difficult one even for the parents to navigate. How much pressure do you put on the kid to keep going to Mass? Now, in our house, you have to go to Mass until you're 18. After that, I guess you can decide for yourself. And when the adult kids come home, If one is not inclined to go to Mass on Sunday, I make them go to Mass. Not on the view that I'm making you be more religious than you want to be, but you're not going to scandalize your little brothers and sisters. So I put it on the terms of an obligation, a moral obligation to their siblings, not to sort of undermine or corrupt them, and not as a matter of me making them go to church or going to church sort of for my sake, because I want it. So I use it as an example, because even within the family, it's a very difficult question where to put the brakes on and where to hit the gas. And someone looking from outside, maybe not a distant neighbor's family, but a relative's family or a colleague's family, you might well think that I think the parents are inappropriately making their college children attend the Latin Mass, which they clearly don't want to do, but the parents think they have to. Now, what should I do? Not stand athwart the church door and say, you don't have to come in, but rather I might say something to a colleague like, in our house, you have to go to church until high school is over, and then you decide. But I might take it up. So it would be, I think, respecting the limits of my competence and jurisdiction, if you will, but saying something. I think probably in limit cases, not just involving the headdress, the veil or the hijab, the scarf, but even, let's say, for parents who don't believe in medical treatment of their children. Here the law and neighbors, maybe other members of the church, if not every member, if the case is that not every member of the church is also a faith healer, where somebody's life is at stake, or well-being in a more significant but not lethal way, I think more dramatic action is important. I do think that government, public authority should be very wary, not give it up for Lent and the rest of the year too, not give it up entirely, but should be very wary. And in our country, the government is very wary of intervening within churches to protect people from not only unfair treatment by their fellows, but almost coercive treatment by their fellows. So like just for example, in some Protestant congregations, maybe those which fashion themselves to be a bit primitive, I don't think you see it in the Catholic Church, but the practice of shunning is common. Some churches will not only say, or mean by shunning, that members of the church shouldn't really interact with that person really should be thrown out of the church. But sometimes it goes so far as where the pastor says to everybody in the congregation, you're not allowed to do business with Jack, who's the fallen away disciple. Nobody can use him as a plumber. I think that's wrong. I mean, I personally think that's wrong and violates not only other norms, but norms of religious liberty. But I think the government should be very wary of doing anything to protect Jack from that kind of treatment. So I think principally because all of this is really of value, insofar as people are freely embracing religion and freely affirming the truth of propositions about divine matters, since the will and freedom is almost always engaged, and however benightedly they're acting, probably almost everybody in these contexts are acting in good faith, probably according to what they think God is requiring them to do, whether it's the parents, the pastor at Jack's church, or you name it. I think it's just very little room for the coercion of government to work fruitfully, and that for the most part, doing what one properly can to protect others is a matter of remonstrating, maybe more than remonstrating, and actually saying, look, saying, for example, which I consider to be more than remonstrating, I feel as if this is simply wrong, and you're treating your kids badly, and I don't think you should do that. And maybe it becomes apparent that I'm suggesting I would think of disfellowshipping you if you keep terrorizing your kids because they don't go to the Latin Mass. Yeah, John.
Extremely interesting, thank you very much. Just two things. One is, just to pick up something, you were expressing, let's say, how should we say, a certain, I won't say you were complaining about, let's just say you were raising questions as to whether enough had been said in the context of some of these. But there's another question whether the wrong thing is said, and I'm struck by because I don't think this use of the common good, for example, corresponds to that of Thomas Aquinas, for instance. I think this instrumentalizes the common good. It makes it sound like it's a set of conditions in order that individuals can attain certain sort of states and conditions, whereas
Professor Haldane, could you speak a little louder?
yeah,
please?
sorry, I'm saying I think that this concept of the common good is an instrument, as we've had it quoted to us, instrumentalizes the notion of the common good. It's not the common good as it occurs in Thomas Aquinas in these documents, because it makes these as social it's actually very interesting. Rawls has one reference to the common good of the entire corpus of his writings.
Even louder.
John Rawls has one reference to the common good in the totality of his writings, and it's very analogous to this, right? It's a condition for individuals to flourish, and for his case, it's a well-ordered polity, that's what it is, right? Whereas in Thomas, the common good is a participatory good. I mean, it's not just it's an instrument for the individual, right? There is a good that attaches to social life. It's not available to the individual. It's not an instrument to the individual's own good. In that sense, it's strictly, as I say,
No, that's
point number two, I just wanted to ask you, you draw that contrast between conscience on the one side and religious liberty on the other. And I think it's very important from what you said, that you took the condition to be, or conditions to be, that the culture takes it there is some truth to it, right? Not that it is true, this is true or that is true. So that this could be satisfied by everybody's coming to an atheistic conclusion, right? We're taking it seriously with our question. But the interesting case here is do you want to say the same thing about morality? Because it seems to me actually, I think we should say the same thing about morality, right? Whereas it made it look as if morality was stuff about conscience. Whereas I think actually, well, I'm asking you, do you want to say the same about morality as to what you said about religion?
I think very largely, yes. I think I know what you're saying. How should I put it? One way to put it provocatively would be, what is conscience? And what is conscientious objection? Name a case that you read about this morning in the newspaper. A doctor or a nurse in abortion, something about same-sex marriage, the florist, contraception, someone involved in death penalty doesn't want any number of cases. But what is conscientious objection? Not so much what is its value. What is it without truth? Whether religious truth involved, religiously inspired and grounded moral truth, or just plain moral truth. You know, there's a contrast, in this contrast, I think it's not much. In other words, it's really a matter of me. Without truth, it becomes an aspect of my identity. And what I call conscientious objection, and assert a legal or at least a moral right not to have to do the flowers for the gay wedding, that actually, without truth being in the picture, appears to be a kind of selfish insistence on not compromising when I'm dealing with other people and their interests. It seems egotistical if it's a matter of, as the world might construe it, this is my identity. I happen to be a Christian believer. Or, as sometimes even in legal cases, courts will say, which is not tracking what the believer says, but courts will listen to the believer and sometimes render it as, she identifies as a Muslim, or he identifies as a Christian. Just lapsing into the language of identity. Well, when that happens, you're talking about what's the importance of my living according to my identity, you might say 24/7. When other persons with an equally valid claim to live by their identity 24/7 are being injured by my particular point of view. Now, when truth drops out of the equation, both moral and religious, I think you can see that if you compare Thomas More with The Man for All Seasons. Bolt's More is a little bit more of an existential More. There's one scene where Paul Scofield, I can't imitate him, but I'm going to try to mimic him up to a point. Paul Scofield is saying, but it's me. This will be the end of me if I do this. I mean, as if it's a kind of suicide. But actually, it's really not me. I'm, like any martyr to be, transparent for him, or I'm transparent for the truth. And further, the value of conscientious objection when it's rooted in, let's say, religion, has a value that transcends the particular dispute about gay marriage and flowers, or take an older example, whether bearing arms is contrary or not contrary to Christian beliefs. Because people who split about pacifism, a good old-fashioned patriotic Presbyterian, can respect and have a kind of fruitful engagement with, and even agree about what to do with a Mennonite. Because they can both agree that it's very important to the polity that everybody witness to the overriding value of religion. But when religion is acknowledged to be a kind of social or common good, and if there's a common good in religion, the patriotic Presbyterian could say, I don't agree with you, Desmond Doss, or whoever it is that's a conscientious objector. But I do think that you should fight, and maybe it's unfair if you don't, that's a different question. But I think we can agree that it's very important for the law to deal with your beliefs and respect your beliefs, because we live in a community that takes religion seriously, and we recognize that when someone in good faith asserts that religion prevents them from bearing arms, that person is asserting, I have a higher obligation to God than I do to my country. And the Presbyterian may not, but he nonetheless should say, damn right about that. We all have to affirm that. We should all affirm that we're the king's good servant, but God's first. So there can be common ground between what I'm calling the patriotic Presbyterian and the dissenting pacifistic Mennonite, precisely because they recognize both what religion's about, its nature, and the primacy of its demands. But when it's about identity and kind of asserting a right, this would be the view of people of the florists and cake makers and photographers of gay weddings. You know, to tend to get inside, as John asked us to this morning, get inside what people are thinking of that who are disagreeing with you about how to treat them. Well, here I think some of the disagreement is in really that if you have a certain view of the background of religion and conscience and all of that, it's that the photographer is actually asserting a right, asserting an entitlement to, how should I put it, to kind of refusing to compromise as the price of citizenship. Just refusing to do what all of us have to do, which is to recognize that identity is a very important thing, but it's a private good. Okay, identity and subjectivity, they're private goods. They have to do with expressing myself in private. Where the background norm, for those who disagree with me, for example, about how to treat conscientious objectors in these cases, the background norm is that the price of citizenship is that when you enter into the public realm, you play according to the rules that the pluralistic society has agreed upon. And it's egotistical to insist that you can enter the public realm sort of on your private terms, something like that. Yes?
I'd like to thank you very much. This helped my own thinking in many respects. Following up on this gentleman's question, I was struck by your use of the political common good.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if this is somewhat of a hat tip to John Finnis's understanding of the political common good. And if so, might this be a way of reconciling Gaudium et Spes in the documents that you've cited and Thomas Aquinas?
Well, I don't know, quite possibly. I wasn't myself thinking of Finnis in this regard. Of course, Finnis defines the common good. He relies upon the council. He doesn't try to improve upon the council or even refashion the language. So now there's a debate to which John Haldane, I think, is alluding, a lively debate among some scholars, even some of the founding members of the APPI, about whether the common good as we find it in these more recent documents can properly be called instrumental. And if it can be called instrumental, and should be, is that really a criticism of these formulations? About that, I'm a bit agnostic. And I think most recently, that debate has kind of died down and just simmering at most. Maybe it doesn't matter too much. If you leave out the word instrumental, perhaps most of the contending parties could agree upon other adjectives and evaluations, leaving aside the word instrumental. For myself, what I tried to do in the first 2 or 3 pages of the paper is to set up the last thing I did say about the unsurpassably important truth in these formulations, and this is where I would leave my response to your question. I don't know what to make of the common good, you might say, except what I read in these documents. But I do think we could think of what we read in these documents with these 2 caveats in mind. One is that I think they probably are accounts of the common good with a view to the political. And in that respect, it's about the political common good. It's what the state can do to promote flourishing. But 2, they're probably also, to some extent, maximal expressions of the content of a proper or good social environment. So again, conducive to perfection, relatively easy access in the fullness of measure. I think they're maximal affirmations of the good society, consistent with each one being master of his or her own life meaning directing oneself by and through free choices to perfection. So again, affirming, you might say in the first place, that each one of us is called, as you can see this all over Dignitatis Humanae, but it's obviously in the Gospels as well. Each one of us is called to see, judge, decide, be convicted, and then live as a disciple. So in that respect, again, affirming the primacy of self-direction towards the truth. In that respect, not contemporary autonomy, which is self-invention, right? So affirm that, but then you might say, affirm as much as you possibly can about the social conditions, an ensemble of circumstance, which will help people do that. That might be a way to capture what they say. Now, I do think it's a real deficit that not only the word, but the concept of culture is at best inchoate in these formulations of the common good. I mean, they talk about the conditions conducive to relatively easy access to perfection. Again, it's not creative interpretation on my part to say, well, obviously, culture is part, the biggest part, the most important part of that definition. But it's in there, but it's inchoate. And it's remarkable to me that in Dignitatis Humanae you don't see something much more explicit about it. Yep.
I want to go back to a couple questions ago, and you really centered a lot of your talk around this concept of coercion and more generally avoiding pressure, as you put it,
Yeah.
which I think is that's from Dignitatis Humanae.
Yep.
I just wanted to understand more about how you understand that, because I've just never gotten what Dignitatis Humanae is talking about there. And I'll give a couple examples. If a man is in love with a woman, and she says to him, I can't marry you because you're not Catholic, how is that not pressure? He's actually in love with her.
Well, it is and it isn't, right? Declaring that I'm a person who would not enter into marriage with someone who didn't share my religion is, it's true. Assuming it's true, it is something you should certainly share with the suitor. Now, it may have some effect upon that person as an inducement, but I think that
It will have some effect on
yeah, no, unless you're not really into her, who knows, right? But I had this experience, let's see, my daughter Laura got married October 29th, 2016. So about 10 months before that, my now son-in-law Bill, I got the call. He's a military guy, he was in Annapolis. To make a long story short, I got a call. I was visiting the DC area and then went to Annapolis to visit my sister and brother. And Bill kind of called out of nowhere. He's been dating my daughter for 2 or 3 years, but out of nowhere, Bill says, can we get together and talk? And I went, oh my. And I have 3 daughters, one other of whom is married. I said, oh my God, he wants to have the talk. I don't like, I'm Irish, I'm 60, I don't talk about feelings. It just doesn't work for me. But Bill wanted to get together, we sat down. He said, I love your daughter and I want to marry her. I said, you're a wonderful guy, really a sterling record in Afghanistan and Iraq, so I had no complaints about Bill, but he's not Catholic. And he also travels too much for his job. Because I have 2 concerns. One is you're traveling too much, and he does travel too much. And I said, you're not Catholic. Laura can speak for herself, my daughter, but I have to say, we're a family where this is a big deal. And he said, I don't remember the exact word, but he said something like, well, I would certainly consider taking instruction, but I said, don't do it for me or for Laura. If you become Catholic, that would be fine, but you should not do that, save because you think it's the way to go, and that you think there's something there, and I think eventually I said, and you think it's true. So that's an example of where I think we should avoid imposing pressure. But again, I said, we're a family where religion is very important, and we've raised 8 kids, and my wife and I are Catholic. I said, it's hard for me to imagine how to raise a family of 8 kids without a shared set of convictions about those matters. So that's a worry. Now, indirectly or effectively, there's some pressure there, but I wanted to push back against it. And I think, to respond to your question more generally, I think I would take a pretty hard line on this topic about what counts as unworthy persuasion, partly because I think the Council is inviting us to sweep very broadly and to look askance, if not condemn, really quite a wide variety of unworthy persuasion and proselytizing, sort of the kind of hucksterism you might see on TV, and also up and down the food chain, from crude apocalyptic threats, to people saying, I won't come down from the prayer tower unless you give me a lot of money kind of stuff, where I think we're really being called to reason about religion, not to be reticent about religion, and not to be embarrassed to talk about it, and to say, look, I think it's true, and I'll talk to you about why I think that, but to engage people's freedom and their judgment. Now, on that, I would be very aggressive. Engage people's freedom and judgment aggressively. Talk to them about what they believe, why they don't believe it, why they believe this. But on the matter of pressure, I would say we should be very scrupulous. And the main reason is a danger of putting too fine a point on it, I suppose. But the main thing, obviously, is for people to come to discipleship as disciples because they want to be disciples. Not because the girlfriend will like it or the father-in-law will like it. Not because I'll get in better with the boss. And not for any reason other than I believe Jesus is Lord. Now, I recognize in the human condition there's maybe never a situation, even with the truth of any proposition, well, maybe some, mathematics, but mostly people come to the convictions they have under some kind of social, or at least in a social context, and maybe even under, at least in most cases, some social influence. Agreed. I don't see any reason why we would deny the kind of the sociology of knowledge, let's call it. But nonetheless, I think even recognizing all of that, that I think believers ought to be very scrupulous to bring others to the faith everywhere and every time they can, but by engaging freedom and judgment. Not inducements, you get ahead, even get ahead in the church. So just one quick example of Benedict said something that comes to mind now. And it was one of the many things that not Ratzinger, but Benedict said that I think was shockingly candid and realistic, and in a certain way I found it very admirable. The Pope said he was asked at some kind of talk he was giving for seminarians in the hills of Rome. He was asked about, by a questioner, and I remember seeing this in Origins, which is the bishop's kind of newsletter, weekly newsletter. But here is Benedict. I'm going to paraphrase, but it's close to what he said. Question, aren't you delighted that there are so many vocations to the priesthood in Africa? Benedict says, I'm not sure that I am. Because I know that in the cultures in so many of those countries, people come to the priesthood because it's an opportunity for a better life that is available to those men in the villages, which is kind of scrupulous. Like you might say, yippee, they're just more priests, and they're not corrupt, and they don't have, mistresses. What's to complain about? But nonetheless, he's right? That people are coming to the priesthood partly because they're getting, and now, again, there but for the grace of God go I, or my Irish ancestors in America, because how many sisters and priests in the old days in America, especially for the women, I mean, how many opportunities would women have, not for advancement in any crass sense, but just for any kind of life outside the home, as a married person, saved through becoming a sister. As a sister, a woman, a Catholic woman in the older days, could operate really quite freely and effectively in the world. And it may have been one of the very few pathways where any woman, Irish Catholic woman, young woman, girl with smarts, could have a career. So again, in a way, I don't want to be critical of even the priests in Africa, but nonetheless, Benedict is right. You have to be a little ambivalent about it.
One of my obligations is to make sure speakers get to the airport for their flights. And this speaker hasn't flown, and so I'm afraid, reluctantly, we have to call the end of this conference. But it's been a wonderful conference. Thank you all, the speakers especially, who have done so much to really make it a great couple of days. And I look forward to seeing you at future APPI events and again next year.
Can I say one thing?